Hey there, my name is Rebecca Devitt. I'm the author of Why on Earth Homeschool, and today we're going to be talking about Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Before we get started, I want to ask if you're sick of traditional education and how it only teaches children about IQ, it only teaches them to use their words and often mathematical abilities, and it doesn't develop their other talents. You're a bit sick of that, and that's what this video will address. This video will address how you can address their other talents, how you might be able to develop their musical abilities, their bodily kinesthetic, their sporting prowess, those talents. There's a lot of other talents and we can work through them. Howard Gardner liked to call these intelligences, so I'll be switching between both of those words in this video. First, we'll get started with the definition. So what is multiple intelligences? Top Hat gave this definition. They said it's a theory first posited by the Harvard developmental psychologist Howard Gardner in 1983. It suggests that human intelligence can be differentiated into 8 modalities: visual, spatial, verbal, linguistic, musical, rhythmic, logical, mathematical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalistic, and bodily kinesthetic. So skewing previously narrow preconceived notions of learning capabilities like the IQ test. The idea behind the theory of multiple intelligences, and this is the kicker line, is that people learn in a variety of different ways. So who was Howard Gardner? Howard Gardner is a Harvard professor, so he's a developmental psychologist. He's currently the senior fellow at the Harvard Project Zero and co-director of the Good Project. He's written hundreds of research articles and 30 books which have been translated into lots of different languages. He's best known for his theory of multiple intelligences, and his book is called Frames of Mind, the Theory of Multiple Intelligences. The 8 intelligences are logical, mathematical, linguistic, musical, visual, spatial, intrapersonal, interpersonal, bodily kinesthetic, and naturalist. Before we get started and we dive into what each one is about, I'd just like to explore the relevance of it. So I'd ask you to imagine if you've ever been at a lecture, or perhaps you've been in church and the minister, he gives you an analogy. And for me, I'm not very interested in sports. And so when one of the ministers likes to give sporting analogies, so when he does that, I find it perhaps a little bit more difficult to concentrate than if he were to give me an analogy that was based on historical characters. So if he gave me an analogy based on historical characters, I would remember it a lot more, because that's my thing. I love history, but I'm not that into sports. But my husband loves sports, that's his thing. And so if the minister were to give that analogy, he would remember that more than history, which he isn't really into. To start with, there is logical, mathematical intelligence. People who are good at this tend to be very orderly. They tend to really like doing math. They tend to like constructing arguments based on logic and reason. A good example of this might be Sir Isaac Newton. He was very good with the scientific process. If your child has this sort of intelligence, how are you going to teach using that intelligence? Well, you're going to want to use numbers. You might get them to debate, because in that way they have to use logic and reason to construct their arguments if they're going to be good at debating. You might get them to do a survey and they have to chart the results of those surveys. Then there's musical intelligence. If you're musically intelligent, you're going to tend to love things that have a good beat, rhythm. You're going to be able to make songs easily. You might be able to jam easily. You'll be quite strong in musical pursuits. An example of who might be quite musically talented would have been Beethoven or Bach, Mozart. How are you going to teach a child who is musically talented? You might get them to create a podcast or make a song about a subject you're learning. You might also get them to create a song about the periodic table. Chemistry might be a subject that they're not interested in, but if they learn it through song, they're going to learn so much better. Then there's linguistic intelligence. People who are linguistically intelligent tend to like words. They like writing, they like making speeches because they get to use their words in it. And so if you're going to teach a child like this, you'll want to be using words to help them learn. They might like to do things like Scrabble, those sorts of word games. Other ideas for teaching children who are linguistically talented might be getting them to make a script, get them to make videos, write essays, write brochures, anything where they get to use their word. Those who are visually or spatially intelligent tend to be very good at reading maps, knowing where they are. They like to be able to think about things in terms of pictures or illustrations, diagrams, that sort of thing. Somebody I thought of who might be visually talented or have a higher visual intelligence is Grylls. So in his TV show, he would be dropped into the middle of a jungle, and without anything he would have to find his way out of the jungle and fend for himself. So he would have to have quite good direction, figure out what the sun was doing, those sorts of things to survive. If you have a child who is visually or spatially talented, you might want to get them to draw a picture of the topic you're talking about. You could get them to do a PowerPoint and put in maybe perhaps photos, or to create a diagram of the topic you're talking about. Use symbols or colours to help them make sense of their notes. Again, these are going to be the kids where you look down their textbook and you see lots of colourful post-it notes. Interpersonal intelligence, so this is people looking inside themselves. So these people will tend to be very self-aware, very aware of what their own emotions are doing. They enjoy self-reflection and analysis and discovering what their personal strengths are. It struck me that perhaps a person who had intrapersonal intelligence might be more of an introvert. That's just something I thought of, and it just strikes me that when I think of the intrapersonal people I know, they tend to be introverts, but obviously that won't always be the case. People with high intrapersonal intelligence tend to love journaling. If you have a child with high intrapersonal intelligence, you might ask them to think about their weak points and their strengths, and think about how they might test themselves on a subject. You might get them to keep a journal every day of what they're thinking and feeling or what's going on. That could be really great writing practice. And another thing you could do is ask them to summarize the things they've learned in a blog or in an essay. Those with high interpersonal intelligence are those who are very good at interacting with other people. They can tell what's happening in a room and the relationships between different people in the room. They can assess people's motivations and their desires and their intentions rather easily. These people might tend to be more on the extroverted side. And so if you had a child who has high interpersonal intelligence, you might ask them if they can talk to others, and they might be able to teach the class or summarize their topic to the other people in the room. They might like to lead an activity themselves. They always say that the person who is best at a subject is the person who can teach it to other people. And so in that way, they'll be learning by teaching it to others. Those who have high bodily kinesthetic intelligence tend to be great sports people. They tend to be very good at physical movement. They have amazing physical control, dexterity, and hand-eye coordination. An example of this sort of a person might be Michael Jordan, or other famous sports people you might know. So how would you teach somebody who had bodily kinesthetic intelligence? Well, you would get them to move. You would turn the subjects where they're just sitting and writing or reading into movement subjects. So you might get them to act out a skit. You might get them to dance. You might get them to learn by using sporting analogies. Use manipulatives in maths. You might get a math board game, so they actually have to physically move things around. And you might get them to create a collage with their fingers and move to learn a different subject. The last one is the naturalist. Now this particular intelligence has copped a little bit of flack because it is perhaps the most unusual, but it is also the one that I love the most. So people who are high in naturalist intelligence tend to love plants and animals. They love to be outside. They might be green thumbs. They might love owning animals and pets. And they might just like to do a lot of gardening, that sort of thing. These sorts of people also tend to be quite good at nurturing. How would you teach a child who is high in his naturalist intelligence? Well, you would get out into nature and you would use nature to teach your children. This is hard if you've got children in school, but it's a lot easier in the homeschooling setting. So if you're going to do this in the homeschooling setting, I really encourage you to look into Charlotte Mason Homeschooling. She has many amazing resources. You can check out Ambleside online, but she encourages children to get out into nature, to learn, to journal, to keep a nature diary, to sketch trees and animals and plants and get in touch with their names, that sort of thing. How would you do maths if you had a naturalist child? Well, you might do algebra, finding the top of a tree and the shade and the distance, those sorts of things. You might divide by rose petals, those sorts of things. A child who is into nature will learn a lot, and nature is a great teacher. So how do you find out what your kids are good at? What are their intelligences? You have two options, or you can do both. You can either observe your children to find out what their strengths are. You might know that anyway, you might know that now, you might know how good they are at mathematics. The other option is to get them to do a quiz. I did my one at literacynet.org, it was pretty good, and I was quite surprised at the results. I got high in naturalistic intelligence, perhaps that's why that is one of my favourites, and also I was quite high in linguistic intelligence. I'm a writer, I do a lot of blogs, so that wasn't surprising. Now, can you increase your intelligences? Well, certainly. Just like you could increase your IQ score by studying for an exam, you can also increase your different intelligences by working on those areas. For example, if you've just bought a house, you might find that your naturalist intelligence increases because all of a sudden you have a garden that you're working on. Have you just bought a musical instrument and you're learning to play it? Then your musical intelligence will also increase. Okay, so you found out that you score quite poorly in some areas. Can you work on those? Absolutely. Do you ignore the intelligences you're not very good at? So what you want to do is you certainly want to know your strengths, but you also want to know your weaknesses. And in this way, it helps you to identify areas you might be weak in, and then it's your decision whether you're going to improve that or not. For me, I scored quite poorly in the musical area, and so I went out and I bought a piano, and I'm teaching myself piano at the moment. This theory has also copped a bit of criticism because Howard Gardner called it intelligences. He called it multiple intelligences. A lot of people said, well, we already have a word for what your theory is, and we like to call that talents. And for that reason, I have used that word interchangeably throughout this presentation. I do prefer the word talents. You could say we're working on our talents. It's just because IQ, when we talk about IQ, most people understand that as the mathematical, logical intelligence we were talking about. And I think sometimes it does confuse the matter a little bit. So I like the word talents, but it's up to you what you call it. Can you use this homeschooling method on its own? My answer to that question would be no. I don't think there's definitely not a curriculum for it, and there's probably not enough material to do it on its own. Wouldn't it be great if there was? But I think it's probably best to use it in conjunction with another homeschooling method. If you have not yet decided what homeschooling method you are, or you think that perhaps you want to change homeschooling method, and it's always really helpful to re-look at whether the homeschooling method you're using at the moment is the most suitable one for you and your family. And for that reason, I recommend you do my homeschooling quiz, howdoihomeschool.com. Just navigate up to the quiz tab at the top, and then you can click on that and sign up, and I'll send you a beautiful quiz you'll love doing and you'll learn a lot from. So where do you go from here? First of all, you want to be discovering what intelligences or talents your children have. And then you want to be thinking about, how can I personalize my child's education using these intelligences? Go back over the video, have a look at the examples that I've given. They're really practical examples, and I guarantee that if you do that, their education will be more fun, you'll enjoy it more. For example, it seems like a lot of work, but if you just spend a little bit of time thinking about what their intelligence might be, you could save a lot of hassle. An example I like to use is with mathematics. A child is sitting there crying at their textbook looking at the maths because they don't want to do it, and that's making your life hell too, because you're sitting there going, oh, I hate this. How can you make that situation work? Okay, so for example, the child is kinesthetically talented. Okay, what are we going to do? We're going to get a math game. We're going to get a math game where they can move the pieces around themselves. We're going to get some manipulatives to make this fun for them. And that way they're going to love math more, they're going to make your job easier, and they're going to learn it better. I'll have the link for the quiz, the Multiple Intelligences quiz, in the description below the video. Also, don't forget to head to my website and check out what homeschooling method you are. Make sure you comment down below what your results were. Were you surprised by them? I'd be really interested to hear about it. Thanks a lot. Bye.